Welcome to another session of the Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Global Summit. I'm Dr. Ron Siegel, a clinical psychologist at Harvard Medical School in the USA, and I'll be your host for this session. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Conor H. Murray, a pioneering neuroscientist who studies the effects of psychedelics in the brain. Welcome, Dr. Murray. Thank you so much for joining the summit.
Thanks for having me, Ron.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. And first, I'd like to share a little bit about your background for people who might not know your work. So Dr. Conor H. Murray is a neuroscientist and assistant project scientist at UCLA. His work focuses on the neurobiology of addiction, consciousness, and the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. He's a core member of UCLA's Psychedelic Studies Initiative, where he investigates how compounds like psilocybin, LSD, and cannabis influence brain function and mental health. Dr. Murray uses advanced tools such as EEG and fMRI to explore how psychedelics affect brain networks, neuroplasticity, and cognitive processes. He currently leads a pilot clinical trial exploring psilocybin as a treatment for cocaine use disorder and is a key contributor to UCLA's Psychedelic Studies Initiatives, a multidisciplinary program focused on consciousness research and novel mental health therapies. His research has been published in leading scientific journals and presented at major conferences in neuroscience and psychedelic science. So I'm very excited to have our conversation because I'm a clinician, not a researcher, but I love to be informed by what's known in the research world because I, despite being interested in psychedelics, think that the scientific method has a great deal to offer us. So I'd like to start a little bit with getting to know you and how you got into this, and then we'll get into the meat of the matter and particularly talk about microdosing. But since you've built this career at the intersection of neuroscience, addiction, and consciousness, what got you first interested in that, and then what drew you to psychedelic research in particular?
Well, it really began with psychedelic research, and as you're a clinician and a healer, in a sense, I view myself as, of course, a researcher, but an explorer primarily. And I was initially really inspired by the writings of Alan Watts. Before I even knew who Alan Watts was, I was just, as essentially a child of the internet, you have all of this information at your disposal. So during high school, I was actually Googling religious experiences, a topic of mine that I was interested in, having some interesting meditative experiences myself, and then stumbled upon this work, Psychedelics and Religious Experience by Alan Watts, published in 1968. But it was on some website that looked like some internet blogger had just written this. But it was powerful enough that it brought me to tears. I really felt like there was someone out there that had been experiencing similar things to what I had been experiencing, and that made this reproducible. It made it an observation. It made it something that was worth exploring. It was written in the California Law Review to argue that these things should be legal for people to study further. And we're really talking about his own investigations into these things. And so from a very basic science standpoint, I wanted to understand what it is that people experience during these states, how it is that they experience them, which is where the neuroscience comes in. And then ultimately, there seems to be, through the transformative aspects of these experiences, therapeutic potential as well. So pursuing a PhD in neuroscience, pursuing medicine, that was all strategic to try to ultimately bring out the larger understanding of these experiences. So again, I see myself as an explorer in these states, and definitely don't consider myself a clinician whatsoever. But I think it's great if these can be used not only as observational agents, but also as therapeutic agents for folks with psychiatric and other conditions.
Yeah. Forgive my smile. I was reading Alan Watts circa 1971 at the same time as experimenting with psychedelics, had a profound transpersonal experience. And that's why I'm a psychologist rather than a mechanical engineer. So I very much resonate with the experience of there's something very interesting here, and I want to understand it better.
Exactly.
Since our theme in this part of the summit involves microdosing, let's start with understanding that a little bit more. In your study of this and your reading of the research, what would you define as a microdose? Where are its boundaries?
Sure. Well, first of all, it was very serendipitous that I stumbled into the microdosing research world. I had really no interest in that whatsoever, but it was after getting my PhD in neuroscience, focusing on models of addiction, that I then moved into a laboratory that was studying substances in humans. Previously, I was doing preclinical research in rodents. Now I'm in a human lab, and on my first day of the job, in a lab that I know studies alcohol, amphetamines, substance use disorder things. The professor says, I've got a low dose LSD, microdosing LSD study I'd like you to work on. It's all very under wraps. And I thought, well, this is great. My whole interest, my whole reason for being in this field is to study psychedelics. Here's the doorway to do that, is studying these low doses in this particular trial. And so what she did her name's Harriet DeWitt, as a very prominent psychopharmacologist, was she was looking at dose-dependent effects. Can we not only find in a placebo-controlled trial whether the same doses that people say they're using out there in the wild, which it turned out on average was 13 micrograms of LSD, whether we could see any detectable difference relative to placebo on measures of as basic as, do you feel anything at all on a scale of 0 to 100, and look at that at different time points of the day, to more interesting questions like altered states of consciousness questionnaires, which gets at things like oceanic boundlessness or dread of ego dissolution, things you would see on much higher doses. And so what she did as a really good psychopharmacologist was she had this dose-dependent design looking at 0 micrograms of LSD, that's the placebo condition, the 13 micrograms LSD condition, which is what most people were saying they were doing in the wild, and then doubling that up to 26 micrograms LSD in what's called a within subjects design, where people would come to the laboratory on 3 different visits spaced 1 week apart. So over 3 weeks, they come in 3 different times, randomized, double blind. They don't know what they're going to get on any particular visit. They also don't know what they're signing up for. It's the human behavioral pharmacology lab where the consent form says you might receive a sedative, a stimulant, a cannabinoid, hallucinogen.
Oh, they had no idea. That's
no idea. They're not people who are usually microdosing. They've never heard of microdosing, and they're all healthy subjects. So that gives you a little bit of the sense of what's going on here. But what these 2 doses revealed mapped on really nicely to what people say microdosing is supposed to be in the wild. We can go back to James Fadiman, considered the godfather of microdosing, and he'll walk his own language back. He said some, schmuck some years ago said that microdosing was supposed to be sub-perceptual. I was that guy. I was the one who said it was supposed to be sub-perceptual. Now he's kind of evolved and said, well, it should be, sub-hallucinogenic. You should be able to feel better. So it should be, psychoactive, but not to the point that you are interfering with your day. So I think that's where the conversation has evolved. But what was interesting about the doses that we used in our study is that they mapped on very nicely to sub-perceptual and sub-hallucinogenic. That's because at the 13 microgram dose, when we asked people, do you feel anything at all on a scale of 0 to 100, there was no significant difference than placebo. They couldn't feel anything at that 13 microgram dose. And yet when we looked at the brain, we would see interesting things that happened that we wouldn't see at the other 2 doses at 0 or 26, like a sweet spot happening at this dose that you're having is a sub-perceptual place, which was exciting for James Fadiman. He said, well, maybe I need to go back again and say the sub-perceptual is actually where we need to be. That might be that sweet spot dose. It's an interesting conversation. Now, the 26 microgram dose, the double dose, that you could consider as sub-hallucinogenic. So it's higher. You can feel something, statistically significant increase of I feel something overall. I don't know what it is, but I feel I've taken a drug relative to placebo. But relative to placebo, no difference on any of the hallucinogenic rating scales, any of that oceanic boundlessness, any of that dread of ego dissolution. None of that's happening. So it's all sub-hallucinogenic. However, on one of the measures of that scale, there's something called positive mood. And those types of positive mood effects did emerge relative to placebo at the 26 micrograms that we didn't see at 13. So they're kind of feeling maybe a little giddier at that point. Again, sub-hallucinogenic. So how people talk about microdose what it's supposed to be. It's a 10th to a 20th of a typical larger dose. But again, they can talk about it in terms of the sub-perceptual, which I think you can operationalize as not any difference in an overall feel of a drug effect relative to placebo, or whether it's sub-hallucinogenic, which you can operationalize through these altered states of consciousness questionnaires. So those 2 doses, we were able to see what they look like in the brain relative to other drugs at other doses. And that was a paper we published in Neuropsychopharmacology a couple of years ago.
Wow. So fascinating, and raises all sorts of questions for me. Let me see if I can organize them. So one question I have is, if the average person out there who's microdosing is taking the equivalent of 13 micrograms of LSD, and that you find in your studies really is subperceptual, that it can't be distinguished from placebo. And yet Fadiman is saying, well, wait a minute, I was wrong about that. It's actually helpful to have a perceivable dose, as long as it's one that doesn't, I'm translating my language, doesn't interfere with what we'd call the executive functioning, right? The ability to answer an email or do your taxes. So how do you square that most people are actually doing a dose which is subperceptual, even though Fadiman's saying that actually having some perception is optimal?
Well, it'd be interesting to survey that question again and see whether that has increased from 13 to something higher now that he kind of evolved on that topic. But again, I think he's interested in maybe taking some step backs and taking some step back and saying, maybe the 13 microgram dose is actually that sweet spot we were looking for. So you have this whole like cottage industry of microdosing coaches out there that are working one-on-one with people to try to figure out their particular dose. Because as you mentioned, the average population might have been saying 13 micrograms, but what's interesting is that depending on your own neurophysiology, you're going to respond differently to 13 micrograms than other people. And for some folks, it turns out folks who might have more of a negative mood state, maybe a little bit of a different expression of their serotonin system, they'll be more sensitive to the low doses and might even breach some of those thresholds into some altered state effects. So his basic, advice is that you start low and you go slow, and you take time off and you kind of find what works for you. And if it ends up being something that is over the level of perceptibility, which is, again, it's hard, hard to have, a situation with one individual of being able to blind yourself. So that's very difficult to do. Maybe you might cue yourself into thinking that you've, feel something when you might not really. Of course, that is the placebo effect. So along this range, again, it's basically finding what is that optimal place that whether you feel something or not, that at the end of the day, you can look back and say, I had these types of effects that even though I may not have ever attributed them to a drug effect, it just seemed like it was a better day. It seemed like I was in a better mood. It seemed like I was able to get things done, as a cognitive enhancing place. And that's when I termed that subperceptual term, operationalizing it in terms of an overall drug effect. It was that particular question. Do you feel a drug effect? Mm-hmm. Other questions like, do you feel more mental clarity? That was increased on the 13 microgram dose relative to placebo. So,
I see.
Yeah,
so you did find differences.
Yes.
With placebos at 13. It simply wasn't on the level of, forgive the vernacular, I feel a little stoned.
Sure. Yeah. So that's how I think that operationalization, I think, works very well. Do you feel a drug effect? I don't feel a drug effect. The consent form said I was going to take maybe a sedative or a stimulant or a cannabinoid or a hallucinogen. I don't feel any drug effect related to any of those things. But when I'm asking you questions about, on a scale of 1 to 7, do you feel like it's easy answering these questions? And today you're telling me it's more of a 6, whereas last week you said it was more of a 4. You don't even remember what you said last week. But it just happens to be that today you do feel statistically increase of mental clarity today. Right. And so it's subperceptual. Subconsciously, you happen to be feeling better. You scored higher on your elation questionnaire today. You did all these things differently today without you maybe even realizing it. That's where I think the real power of that, more subperceptual sweet spot may be. Now, if some people are saying that they're feeling things as well and they're feeling more productive, then that's another thing to contend with. It's like a cup of coffee, I think, in that sense. I don't think anyone's walking around, not feeling the psychoactive drug effect of caffeine when they're also claiming some benefits from their cup of coffee. And that's kind of a somewhat of a parallel here. Or maybe in some cases, the microdose could work like that. You could still have some benefits and feel it. Or maybe that sweet spot is actually toned down even below the level of what caffeine does in terms of a psychoactive effect.
Well, and much is predicated on the, how people interpret the question of, do I feel a drug effect? Because there are probably many people who have their morning coffee who don't identify it that way.
Yeah.
So two questions that I'd like to explore with you out of this, and the first one is differentiating this from placebo effects, and the study that you and the other investigators did was seems quite elegant and quite good at doing that differentiation. I've sometimes played in talking to clinicians about these topics with a simple quasi-hypnotic induction, which I'll do right now for our listeners. You've just taken something that's making you feel perhaps a little bit more sensitized to the world around you, that colors are a little bit clearer, that maybe you're a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more open to creativity, and just look around the room and take it in with this enhanced awareness. And at least I found, not an experimental design, but just anecdotally, that a lot of people say, oh yeah, I'm starting to feel that. So we're talking about a realm in which suggestion seems like it can play a role. And I mentioned to you before we spoke that the study that at least seemed to get a lot of clinician attention was this 2021 study out of the Imperial College of London, where they did a citizen scientist design, which to my mind looked very clever, where they had people who believed and felt that microdosing was helpful to them to identify whatever the substance was in the usual dose they take it, and through a clever design of having people put their preferred microdose in one envelope and a placebo in another envelope, and differentiating them with QR codes that humans can't readily differentiate, they found that, hey, there wasn't a big difference between whether people were taking the placebo or were taking their what they believed was a helpful microdose. And so first, help us to understand, what did they find there? Were there flaws in that study? And what have we learned since?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, what they found was that there was no significant difference between the microdosing group or the placebo group on the days they were taking microdoses versus placebo. Now, the flaw of the design is that it's a citizen science design, which means it's less rigorous. It's not a clinical trial. It's not something that would pass muster as far as any sort of FDA approval, of course. Now, what we've learned since then is that there have been approved clinical trials of microdoses of LSD, specifically in New Zealand, the first place in the world where you can actually prescribe LSD. They did it in a 6-week protocol design and what they call the Fadiman style protocol, where they have folks take microdoses for 1 day and then 2 days off, and they take a microdose again. Now, it was placebo controlled, and so it was randomized against these groups. Very, very tightly controlled study. It's Robin Murphy et al. 2023 in the journal Biological Psychiatry, a very good journal. And so this really supersedes the citizen science results. It basically, you can almost put a line through the Balazs 2021 study in the history book, in a sense. Science is iterative, and that's interesting data, but it just wasn't, again, a rigorous design. What Robin Murphy showed is that indeed you do have significantly increased reports of things like connectedness, creativity, what we think of when we think of having a microdose type of effect, like you mentioned, with more of that enhanced mindfulness, if you were to walk someone through a kind of mindfulness practice like you just did. These people are walking away with these kinds of things at the end of the day, only on their dose days. They asked them the next day, do you feel, how do you feel now? And there was no difference between the placebo group and the microdosing group on days that they were not microdosing. So it was only on the dose days did they feel that type of way, which is also what people report in the anecdotal cases of microdosing as well. On my test days or dose days, I feel immense love for myself. I don't feel cravings for sugar or other substances. The next day, as you're taking the break, maybe things normalize a little bit. What that particular study looked at as well was at the very beginning of the protocol for the 6 weeks, of microdosing, and then at the very end of the protocol, after the 6 weeks, to try to test another question, which is not only do microdoses have any significant increase relative to placebo, but does a microdosing protocol actually have any change from pre to post this protocol? And that is where they did not see any difference. So the microdose days, yes, the placebo myth, you can put it to bed. But in terms of a microdosing protocol, that's where the placebo question of whether it's just a placebo effect is still valid, because we don't think that, at least I think it'd be kind of silly to say that microdosing is going to cure something. I think, again, it's like caffeine. If you drink coffee for a month, once every few days, that doesn't cure, your tiredness for the rest of your life. You kind of take it as needed. And I think that might be where people are waking up to realizing that this is something that might benefit you while you take it. But the question of actually, can it have any enduring changes? Maybe if there are behavioral changes that you learn while you're taking it on those dose days, but also we haven't rigorously tested that in terms of the neuroplasticity yet. That was a behavioral questionnaire that they looked at, but it seems not so far field to suggest that we already know that single high doses of psychedelics have enduring brain changes, enduring neuroplasticity that's related to improvements in depression, et cetera, that last for up to 3 months in some cases. Can low doses of psychedelics intermittently over a period of time do the same thing? That's an empirical question that you can ask, and that's where my current citizen science study is taking a look at using mobile EEG headbands to track people the 5 days before their protocol and the 5 days after. So even though Rob and Murphy showed there weren't differences in questionnaires related to behavioral, let's say cognitive behavioral tasks or emotion, anxiety types of things, which is good. You might think that you might get dependent on the microdose protocol, like it's a crutch, and then when you take it away, now you're weaker. So she didn't see that, which is good. I'm glad she didn't see significant decreases in cognitive or emotional measures after the 6 weeks. But we don't know still yet whether there's actually brain changes. No one's looked at that before. And so that's where I would like to come in next. And for anyone listening, you can visit cynotics.com and sign up for that citizen science study. It's not going to be as rigorous as the controlled trial in the laboratory environment, but we can get more numbers of people than are involved in the brick and mortar environment. And that might allow us to have more of a statistical power to address these questions.
So this is very interesting, and let's bookmark your study. I want to come back to that and explore it in more detail. But just before we go there, it's interesting. The models of using psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy are typically presented as contrasting with conventional psychopharmacology. In conventional psychopharmacology, we're taking a substance, let's say an SSRI, a common antidepressant, and we're taking it every day. And the theoretical rationale is we're somehow compensating for or adjusting a maladaptive neuropsychological pattern. We're changing the brain in a useful direction, but the idea is that it only works while you're taking the medicine. And the big paradigm shift that people speak about in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is, no, we're going to have an experience which is going to bring a kind of insight, which, if held in with sufficient opportunities for integration, will change your life in positive directions. And I read with amusement the first studies that showed up in the psychiatric professional literature, where the commentators were acting like, well, wait a minute, psilocybin doesn't have a half-life of 6 months. How come people are still feeling better, right? And the key is supposedly the insight. And so that, to me, is a kind of critical question, right? Are there insights that perhaps, you mentioned behavior change, but behavior change, so one level of it is behavior change, another level of it is change in worldview, change in understanding of who I am, change in understanding of what I'm doing with my life, those kinds of insights, might those develop during a microdosing protocol in a way that is lasting? And you're suggesting that what we know so far is we haven't seen it. Am I reading? That's
right. That's definitely my hypothesis. And I think the easy way of thinking about microdoses is that you just turn the dial down. Okay, so we know what it looks like on a very high dose. The dial is way up. You have these huge existential types of insights. But you might also have some pretty alarming situations as well that you might not really be so interested in, the kind of bad trip types of scenarios. Now you turn that dial down, you might have a little bit of anxiety. We do see that with microdoses as well. The same people at the same time, they feel elation, they're also feeling a little bit of anxiety. It's kind of like these big high doses. The same time they're feeling, to soar, angelic, fathom hell or soar angelic, it's those kinds of bad trip, amazing insights, metaphysical experiences and high doses. Dial that down. That's the microdose situation. So the insights, I think you can sort of dial down as well. They may not be as salient, but people still report them anecdotally. They still report some insights. It's not going to be shattering, but it's still happening. And I think that is something that we can take a look at further. James Fadiman will start off some of his speeches by saying people who take psychedelics are often there's a claim that they are becoming better people or something like that. So I think it's kind of that idea is that you can get something like this with these low doses, and it does kind of marry or fall along the spectrum of that more standard model that we see in pharmacology and the pharmaceutical industry to this, take one dose and then, maybe the rest of your life, you don't have an opioid addiction anymore because you just had Ibogaine and it put your brain in a washing machine for 12 hours and the neuroplasticity, has shaken the snow globe and you've resettled in a new type of way. The low doses are taken every few days because it allows the brain to kind of reset, because there's going to be a tolerance that builds up if you were to take them day after day. So it's just a different way of going about it. And I think the future of psychedelic medicine, on one hand, you can say that maybe these low doses are actually the appropriate dose, and a lot of these high doses are actually overdoses. We still don't have an understanding of what an overdose of psychedelics is. There is no overdose of psychedelics. But maybe there should be. Maybe there should be a dose where we consider that actually gets too hallucinogenic in some cases, and we start to lose some of the insights potentially. And I think it's going to be drug specific. So you see this more with LSD, for instance, as more of a hallucinogenic overdose. But it might be different for different indications. Now, if you have end-of-life anxiety and distress, is a microdose going to cut it? No, you need that sort of earth-shattering ego dissolution experience maybe to have those meaningful insights that you wouldn't really glean from the low doses. But if you are having maybe, you're stuck in a rut in your life through depression, and you need these sort of, simple cracks in your ego, not the shattering ones, maybe that's more suited for you. So in my mind, I see both low doses and high doses moving forward in psychedelic medicine in parallel, and often they may be complementary to each other. There's a big conversation now about extending the neuroplasticity window with low doses following a high dose session, for instance. So preparation, integration, they're not mutually exclusive. And I think they'll happen both in parallel and continue to evolve.
I mean, I've seen something interesting clinically in the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy space where high doses of ketamine, will very fairly reliably, particularly with people who are meditators or who are interested in letting go of traditional sense of self or conventional sense of self, will pretty reliably create these profound ego dissolution experiences. But in the higher dose experiences, a few hours later, there's less memory of what has occurred than in a lower dose experience that also tends in this direction, but the person tends to remember more of what occurred during the dosing session. So maybe a different thought about overdose. I don't know that I would call it an overdose, but maybe they have different utilities, and we may find that there's more of a sweet spot.
Agreeing with you that these different levels of doses might be effective for different things, and another point related to that is the psycholytic dose, which they talk about out in Europe a lot, which is another model that's not considered psychedelic assisted therapy the way that it was originally conceived, but at a little bit lower dose, still definitely over the threshold of experience, but kind of in this middle range of dose. So it's another model that people are exploring.
And if you would, can you give us an idea of the neurobiology of microdosing compared to the neurobiology of macrodosing? Do you see similar changes? The ones that are so often touted as an increase in connectivity, in quieting of the default mode network. Are those kinds of things seen in the microdosing as well?
Sure. Yeah, there hasn't been any study to look at the default mode network changes, but there was a study that looked at connectivity changes, and they found a correlation between the improved mood people experienced at 13 micrograms relative to placebo and the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which in my mind is basically saying the cognitive part of your brain is telling your emotional part of your brain to calm down. And so I think that's pretty interesting. We've also seen, differential responses to emotional faces, like less responding to angry faces, for instance, which is something similar to what you see at higher doses as well. Some things that we see are kind of specific to the low doses. One thing I'll do mention, though, I want to mention is that we do see an increase in neural complexity, which seems to be a dose-dependent response. So maybe at these much higher doses, that's related to kind of a noisier brain state. So we don't really know yet the significance of having increased complexity at low doses. I had a little bit of a side analysis that suggests that maybe improvements in behavioral recognition or the behavioral tasks where you're recognizing faces and there was an improvement in your ability to recognize faces seem to correlate with some of the increased complexity from LSD, but that's something we're digging into a little bit further. But on the point of maybe some things happening in the brain that are unique to these low doses that we don't see at high doses was a particular task where people were earning monetary rewards. They were winning money every time they press a button correctly. And the brain responds to that as soon as you see on the screen, hey, you've won. Your brain recognizes that and you process that. And if you have depression, that's going to be a blunted response. Same thing with the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. That's blunted connectivity in depression. The microdoses facilitated that connectivity. Here, that response to earning rewards, it facilitated that brain response, but only at the 13 microgram dose, that kind of sweet spot dose. As we cranked it up a little higher to 26, there was no different from placebo. And you can imagine if you cranked it even higher to 100 micrograms or 200 micrograms, are you even seeing that you won on the screen? Your perception might be so distorted that it's unrecognizable, in that sense, what's actually appearing on the screen in front of you. So I think that really lends credence to the idea of the sweet spot neurobiologically.
Yeah. A little bit assuming there that wanting to have a strong reward response to winning something is a good thing.
Exactly. And it is in terms of that's a rescued phenotype in terms of I imagine playing ping pong and you're playing ping pong and you're winning, but every time you win that point, because you're depressed, you can't even smile. So to me, it's like the brain's smile. Your brain is smiling good when you're opening yourself up to rewards. Yes, it's not suggesting that it's a reinforcing drug effect. That's a bit of a different question because we're talking about just the monetary reward is modeling naturalistic rewards in a sense.
Right. And as a clinician, shouldn't be framing things perhaps as good or bad, but I do see it as if somebody's kind of depressed, to be able to be engaged in life and to be able to feel joy or pleasure or a sense of reward when something good happens, that seems like, well, that's a good thing, right? Because the depression tends to blunt that. But then again, many of us are kind of addicted to constant rewards with our phones, with the fridge, with substances, and they're having some perspective on that and a bit of a capacity to hold the desire for the reward lightly seems like a good thing.
Yeah. I might get into, the psychedelics. What's interesting is that it helps to, flatten the brain's energy landscape, or basically, allows us to, decouple from these things that typically might be latching onto our attention, the priors of, whether it's your cell phone use or, other types of substance use disorders. It allows us to kind of be, in a sense, more centered and not so latched onto those things. And so that seems to be one real beauty of these at any dose, is that it allows you to kind of, disintegrate from those, maladaptive behaviors.
Yeah, kind of hold them a little bit, hold the instinctual urges a little bit more lightly.
Mm-hmm.
So you've also done work with cannabis, which is, as a clinician, I find cannabis fascinating in part because different people seem to respond so radically differently to it. I'll have one person say, "Oh yeah, I constantly get caught in negative thought loops and become, quote, paranoid with cannabis," and somebody else who is quite capable of torturing themselves with negative thoughts while not under the influence of cannabis says, "Oh no, this really relaxes me because I don't take my thoughts seriously under cannabis." Can you give us an idea of what effects you see cannabis producing? Are they variable depending on the individual? And how do they compare to, say, the more classical psychedelics such as LSD?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, yeah, definitely there are, individual variability, in the population, how people respond. And so one of my papers looked at age as a key factor. So it turns out you have much more cannabinoid receptors in your brain during adolescence. And so the experience of cannabis during adolescence, it actually is going to impair you more cognitively than as an adult. You see this in rodents as well. But what you see actually as you go into adulthood is that it looks like maybe the cannabinoid receptors are kind of spared in the emotional centers as you age. And so you maybe lose the headiness of the high when you're aging into adulthood, but you retain maybe some of the paranoia into adulthood. And so I think there's kind of this natural aging out of cannabis use. Most people who are using cannabis are adolescents, and you kind of grow out of it. The joke being, unless you're Willie Nelson or Snoop Dogg or something like that to some extent. So I think that's kind of related to the age-related differences. Of course, there are genetic differences, the genes related to the dopamine system. Some people are going to have different responses. Maybe people with ADHD versus not, might respond to it differently. There's a lot of different things. There's sex differences that we're exploring. So how it relates to psychedelics, I mentioned Alan Watts at the beginning, his paper, Psychedelics and Religious Experience. He outlined cannabis as one of those that was most interesting to him and what he had been exploring for these types of religious experiences and psychedelic states. So psychedelic is both an adjective and a noun. Psychedelic means, mind or soul manifesting. So what is mind manifesting? Well, before they, learned that the 5-HT2A receptor is mediating LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT, they were just basing it off of the adjective, the effect, much like a sedative effect or a stimulant effect, hallucinogen. These are all adjectives describing the effect. Nowadays, it's described much more in terms of the receptor pharmacology, like, a GABA antagonist or a, glutamatergic this or that. So it's now defined as the serotonin 5-HT2A, agonist, a serotonergic hallucinogen. So the classic psychedelic is related to this 5-HT2A receptor pharmacology. But again, that's like the noun of psychedelics today. But the adjective is much more open-ended, and it can include ketamine, ibogaine, MDMA in some cases, and cannabis certainly. So all those things they consider in some cases non-classic psychedelics. But if you look at what mind manifesting is, and I have a paper we just published this year to try to operationalize that, is anything truly mind manifesting at all? Or are all these people just having hallucinations every time they're taking whatever they're taking? Well, you could ask that. We looked at a whole range of altered state induction mechanisms, including float tank experiences, meditation experiences, deliriant drugs like high dose overdoses of Benadryl and datura. So these things act on mechanisms that are distinct from psychedelics. No one ever claims they're mind manifesting. And in fact, they induce very dangerous types of delusions and are highly toxic. But you can map out that space of these experiences along the spectrum with these psychedelics, along with cannabis. And what do you find? Well, interestingly, we found a huge divergence between LSD and psilocybin, where we asked people, well, when you're reading these reports, is what we did. We looked at reports online, and we had independent raters rate whether or not people who were reporting these things described them as more authentic or more illusory. So more of a mind manifesting authentic experience or more of a hallucinogenic illusory type of experience. The big divergence between psilocybin and LSD was that folks who are reporting about their experiences with psilocybin often use words like, I gained insight into, I realized, I had clarity about something, whereas the folks on the high doses of LSD often were talking about the big hallucinations and things that were happening. And the dopamine 2 receptor is also a target of LSD, unlike psilocybin, which is more purely on the 5-HT2A receptor. So pharmacologically, it makes sense how these two very common psychedelics diverge somewhat in terms of mind manifesting effects for psilocybin and more hallucinogenic effects for LSD. I think cannabis can lean more into the mind manifesting effects even though it is a completely different pharmacology as well on the cannabinoid receptor. Also, salvia and ketamine were the most interesting in that analysis as being potentially the most mind manifesting as far as having very reproducible observations into like the deconstructed state of consciousness, following time dilation and ego dissolution, very similar types of metaphysical like experiences, similar to what we see in some of the meditation and float tank reports, which, by the way, were all rated as very authentic and not illusory like we saw with datura and high doses of Benadryl. So you have to kind of consider the whole range of altered states of consciousness and where cannabis fits in.
We clearly could use in another entire interview just uncompacting that, and within it, fascinating. I'd like to just pose the little bit of a philosophical conundrum, which is, can we differentiate? So some of these medicines, under some circumstances, have I believe what people commonly call noetic effects is what you're measuring, right? The sense that this somehow is revealing something which is fundamentally true to me. And can we differentiate? And maybe, I don't know the philosophic answer to this. Can we differentiate between, one of the effects of these medicines is to make the subject feel that what is happening in this distorted state is somehow more true, from what this is revealing is something that is more true. As somebody who's been very interested in the world of mindfulness practices and psychotherapy, from for example, a Buddhist psychological framework, to start to see the world as fully transient, constantly changing, the sense of separate self being a constructed narrative, a sense of interconnectedness with all life and the rest of the world. Those truths happen to map out and correspond to what one of the world's wisdom traditions says is the nature of reality. So when we encounter that, it's like, oh, I'm seeing something that I know to be true. But is it the drug that makes it feel true, or are we seeing the truth?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think you can actually address that scientifically. And the real question you're asking is it a kaleidoscope, or is it a prism, telescope, microscope type of effect? And if you can have reproducible observations, when Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter and someone else found it 100 years later, that reproducible observation confirmed that, yes, indeed, there are moons around Jupiter. And so, our experience of this is happening in reality and not just through this kaleidoscopic toy that we're playing with. And so when you can see reproducible experiences and observations and insights independently in people, validated across different induction mechanisms, including float tanks, meditation, and these other things, and seeing that it's not happening in these more hallucinogenic substances like deliriants, I think it really lends credence to what people are claiming might be happening, noetically for them.
We're seeing how consciousness is constructed and something about the nature of reality.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's more of a prismatic effect.
Yeah. Thank you. I could go on for several hours. Thank you for doing the research that you're doing. Thank you for sharing even these brief insights with us. If people would like to find out more about your work, and I'm sorry we didn't get time to describe really quickly, the citizen science experiment that you're involved in, if people want to participate. Tell us about that, and also how to know more about your work.
All of the above. They can visit synautics.com, PSYNAUTICS.com. It's a play on psychonautics, exploring the mind. And I also have another website, connormurrayphd.com as well.
And just tell us very briefly the study, if people did want to sign up, what would they be participating in?
So they would get a study kit in the mail. It includes an EEG headband. They can track 5 days of their brain activity, just 5 minutes at a time before a microdosing protocol, and then 5 minutes a time again, 5 days as well after the microdosing protocol. And so this will test the neuroplasticity changes. We're going to look at 3 biomarkers related to brain health, cognition, emotion, and awareness is what I refer to them as. It's all in the published literature. You can learn more about it on our website. I've recently published a paper looking at how some of those are affected in folks who have heavy cannabis use. And so you can learn more about that on my websites.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me.